Welcome to the chaos. I'm Jill Savage. Today is Wednesday, July 24th, and chaos certainly erupted in the nation's capital as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed Congress. We caught up with Julio Rosas, Blaze Media's national correspondent, earlier today about protests on the ground.
All right, so we're outside Union Station. A lot has happened today. Initially, the protesters that were against Netanyahu speaking to Congress today, they tried to get close to the Capitol building. Police blocked their path because they didn't want them to get close. That resulted in clashes. Police had to use pepper spray. Eventually, the crowd started to move on. They marched around in the Capitol Hill neighborhood before coming here to Union Station. And there's been a lot of clashes. Initially, U.S. Park Police moved in to stop protesters from tearing down the American flags that are normally placed here in Columbus Circle. There was more fighting, more arrests were made. The Park Police withdrew after they secured the American flag and the arrestees. But as they were withdrawing, people were chasing them, they were heckling them. And now, as you can see behind me, the protesters tore down the remaining American flags and then they replaced them with Palestinian flags. It has calmed down a little bit now, but things are pretty tense. There's a lot of police in the vicinity watching and waiting to see what happens.
You can follow Julio on X at Julio_Rosas11 for local coverage that you won't find anywhere else. And for analysis on the situation, I am joined by Matthew Peterson, editor-in-chief of Blaze Media, and Chris Bedford, the senior politics editor and Washington correspondent for Blaze Media. Chris, there is a lot happening on Capitol Hill right now, and I don't want to take liberties here, but why isn't this an insurrection?
Because the Democratic Party and their friends in the media have decided that it's not. It's shocking. I mean, on my side of Capitol Hill, where our offices are, just looking out the window, it's the parade of people walking by. It looks like a Dr. Seuss book. I saw it on Mulberry Street. Very strange folks. Not the type that you would really associate with being Hamas's pals, but it's kind of funny how many of them are. Now, what's striking about what we're seeing here, the flags being torn down, the cops being attacked, flags being burned, is how many members of Congress stand with these people. And it's not just the president skipping his meeting with Netanyahu and saying he's too sick and old. We already kind of know that. It's not just the vice president skipping the speech today to go to a sorority campaign event. The members of Congress who actually did show up, which is not a lot of them, the Democrats wore some of the activist T-shirts that you actually see in the parade. They're closely linked with these folks. And there's something that's really special about seeing someone who is literally a United States legislator, someone who's elected to the democratic process, still unable to give up their street theater theatrics. These folks are actual decision makers in America, but they still wear the funny T-shirts, they hold up the signs, they disrupt the proceedings. Republicans in inviting Netanyahu today to this speech, and Democrats who agreed to it, seem to have laid a pretty serious political trap for the folks for folks in D.C. who stand with a lot of these protesters, and they've fallen headfirst into it. I mean, just take the image that you've seen now of protesters ripping down and burning the American flag, put it next to Donald Trump with blood splattered across his face, putting his fist in the air next to the American flag, and ask people which side they want to choose.
Matthew, I want to bring you in and ask you what you saw from Julio there and just the reporting on the ground that we have seen already. And to Chris's point, all burning of flags and everything. It's just, we knew this day was going to be pretty chaotic, and it's here.
Yeah, sadly, it was everything it promised to be. Burning an American flag, the guy trying to rescue it. I mean, there's these poignant moments today. In fact, right now, Julio's gone back out, and we'll see what happens tonight after the show. But this was baked in, and it's a very odd moment because clearly many people in the United States are rethinking the way in which they thought about foreign policy with Israel. And you see the radical left trying to make this the issue of the moment. I don't know how far it goes, but they're doubled down. They didn't stop. And obviously, there's a couple people who didn't show up today that we should talk about who weren't even present. I mean, really disrespectful.
Let's do that. Kamala Harris is probably the name I'm assuming that you're going to jump to. So, Chris, I'll ask you. She skipped Netanyahu's address, and her office said that she was unable to preside over the joint session because of a previously scheduled Wednesday trip to Indianapolis. So she's now the presumptive nominee here on the Democratic side, if we're going to go along with that, and she can't rearrange her schedule.
Yeah, well, if I was Kamala Harris, I think that maybe she made a politically calculated decision here that actually might check out. She went to a sorority girl event, and now these are the folks that she really does need to shore up votes. She's basically got 100 days to run for president of the United States. And if I was her, I would say, listen, I'm not going to spend my precious few days walking into a Republican public relations trap, even if the majority of the American people think this is an issue of morality, and I think a lot of them do. She would rather go out there to the swing states. She'd rather go out to places where she's going to gin up the vote. And you're going to see this a lot. I mean, seems like there are certain opportunities that are presenting themselves to Kamala Harris to appear presidential, to run kind of a Rose Garden campaign the way that they intended to do for Joe Biden. If you wanted to do that, you might go to the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, for example, and present yourself as America's leader. You don't really have to say that much. You just have to look presidential. You get the pictures, you get the fanfare. To sit there and preside today and to show that America stands with Israel. But that doesn't seem to be the kind of campaign that they want to run. It seems like what they want to do is get out, try to activate those voters, those people who are going to be with her, and those people are going to go to the polls and potentially win this coalition for them. And that's where they're doing it. And you know what? That's probably actually good for Republicans, because when she does go out in public and when she does speak is when she often screws up, and you get an episode of Veep playing out in live camera. It's when she's quiet and looks presidential and lets CNN and TikTok just pretend that she's cool. That's when she's a real threat to the GOP.
Chris, I think her ambiguity or her skill or her ability to change shape as a politician comes in here as well, because you can code her as part of the radical left, and she in fact has been A-OK with supporting the radical left over time. On the other hand, she's perfectly able to say she's tough on crime, right, and at one time in her career, as well as giving the money to bail out criminals in another. So on this issue, which is a divisive issue right now, when it comes to Israel, I mean, this is sort of just literally a dodge out. I'm just not going to be there at all. Because one would assume that the protesters that are in D.C. right now will also be outside of that Democratic National Convention.
Yes, they're going to be there. They're going to be at the White House this evening, which is why the White House has been barricaded in preparation for them. These protesters are hounding the Democrat Party. And this is some of the difficult things that have been invited in. Basically, President Barack Obama was able to unite the pro-Hamas left, the environmentalist left, the union left, the black supremacist left, the illegal immigrants should become American citizens left, and bring them all together into one coalition through the force of his own charisma. But even by the end of his 8 years in office, you started to see him getting shouted down by protesters, him getting yelled at in his own White House by people who he'd let in there to see him speak. And the people who've taken over since, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and now Kamala Harris, they do not have the charisma, they do not have the leadership skills to hold such a fractious group together. And they're beginning to reap that now.
It must be quiet, Kamala, because in your Beltway brief, Chris, you talk about how Kamala Harris has been able to rake in some big campaign money. How has she been able to do that?
It's been unreal, but the way that they've done that, she's done this, is a lot of the commanding heights of the American economy. The tech sector, corporations have for a very long time now been in favor of Democrats. A lot of the wealthiest people, the globalists, et cetera, are in favor of Democrats. And at the same time, the Republican Party has switched from the party of Mitt Romney, which, by the way, when I went to the Republican convention with Mitt Romney, there was Google massage tents and Microsoft parties, and every major corporation had a giant gala with live music and free drinks and swimming mermaids. It was completely insane, the amount of money that was put into that by corporate America. You saw none of that at Trump's last convention just last week. And that's because a lot of that corporate money that knows that the GOP is just going to protect it, well, those same corporations abuse their voters, trade jobs overseas, undercut Main Street. They're facing now opposition from the GOP. So that money goes to the left. There are very few mega donors left who are actually populist conservatives. A couple who are starting to pop up in Silicon Valley, and a few even on Wall Street. But in general, the moneyed interests are behind the globalists.
Chris, I want to go back to this. I mean, the radical left, right? Or you could even say Occupy. I mean, at one time, these people were beating the drums. And we forget that Bernie Sanders, not very long ago, right, was doing much better than he should have been doing, even the second time around. So this cohort is still here. And you can see people, flipping back and forth, sort of confused about the new Democratic Party. Harris isn't confused. But what is going to happen, do you think, at the DNC? I mean, the protests tonight are a sign that these people are ready to burn things down and to go nuts and to pressure from within their own party. And Harris is going to have to somehow make sense of this.
They're tempting fate by doing this in Chicago. I mean, we've written about this, but the last time the Democratic Party met in Chicago for their convention was 1968. The Vietnam War was raging. LBJ in January had said that he was not going to run for president this time, even though he was the incumbent. And that followed him actually losing, or nearly losing, not even losing, a primary in New Hampshire. That kind of scared him and made him realize how unpopular he'd become with the Democratic base. Then you had Bobby Kennedy, the heir apparent, shot down after winning California. And what the Democrats ended up doing at the convention was selecting the vice president to LBJ, someone who hadn't won the plurality of votes, someone who hadn't even really campaigned during that time. They chose him because he was the only person who wasn't super anti-war. He was someone who's going to continue the Democrat go ahead and just go along with the agenda of the elites. And that infuriated a lot of the Democratic activists who were outside, the anti-war activists. And what you ended up with was violence in the streets. You're starting, most of the party and all the elites and the poobahs and the suburban moms and the Lululemon set have united behind Kamala. Those aren't people you have to worry about. But the folks you see out here today protesting in the streets in D.C., they're not united. You see Black Lives Matter's official account, whatever grift operation that is, releasing attacks on Kamala Harris, a black woman, saying that this was not democratic process, sounding like Glenn Beck when they're criticizing Kamala and the democratic process here. And they're completely right. So I think the Democrats are having, generally speaking, until today, have been having a very good week. But that may be going off the rails real soon.
It just might. Thanks so much for your time, because when we come back, Kamala Harris faces some opposition from an unlikely source. Next. If you weren't already following the news, a massive hit to the U.S. dollar just came and went in June when Saudi Arabia didn't renew their 50-year petrodollar deal with the United States. Now, since 1974, Saudi Arabia has sold oil solely in U.S. dollars, and that was huge for our economic dominance. And now they want other options, something other than the dollar. So if there's less demand for the dollar, then what happens to that dollar? Look, it's reasons like this that Americans turn to Birch Gold Group. For over 20 years, Birch Gold has helped tens of thousands of Americans protect their savings by converting an IRA or 401k into an IRA of physical gold. To learn more, text the word Jill to 989898 and claim your free, no obligation info kit on gold. That's Jill to the number 989898. Birch Gold has earned my trust with their first education program. They have thousands of happy customers and countless 5-star reviews. So protect your savings with gold before the dollar plunges any further. Text Jill to 989898 today. Black Lives Matter is not happy over the DNC's push for Vice President Kamala Harris to replace Joe Biden as the DNC nominee. Yesterday, the organization posted a statement to its website alleging the DNC threatens democracy by boxing out voters from its nomination process. It went on to accuse the DNC of trying to manipulate black voters by anointing Kamala Harris without a primary vote. Now, it demands an informal virtual snap primary to fix the problem. Nick Freitas is a member of the Virginia House of Delegates and host of Making the Argument podcast. He joins us now. So, Nick, I might not ever say this again, but does Black Lives Matter have a point? Should we actually be having the DNC holding an immediate primary?
Well, I mean, gosh, BLM is upset that the Party of Democracy is trying to select their candidate in a smoke-filled room where none of them can participate. I'm shocked. But no, they have a point. There's something should be done. I mean, they could have stuck with their candidate, but I guess that wasn't an option. And keep in mind, the Democrats are not getting rid of Joe Biden because of cognitive decline. They're getting rid of him because of polling decline. If he was still 5 points ahead in the polls, they wouldn't care that he wouldn't be able to string a sentence together.
Nick, what did you make of that Sunday switch out on X by Joe Biden saying he's not going to seek re-election?
Well, I think the first question I had and many Americans had was, does Joe Biden know that he's dropping out? Because honestly, we didn't see him for 6 days, and then all of a sudden we get a letter that didn't even really look like his authentic signature. And now I guess we're finally going to find out that, yeah, he really does mean it. He's dropping out. And I guess the only question that we have now is, how many pardons were promised to him in order to get him to do this?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think he needs to tell the American people?
I mean, is there anything at this point that either side really needs to hear to change their mind one way or the other? Look, if he's going to stay in office at this point, the guy's still got the nuclear codes. Now, he made some pretty horrible decisions, and I don't just mean economically. I mean, what he did in Afghanistan was absolutely horrendous. What has happened at the border, absolutely horrendous. And he did that when he still had some vestige of cognitive ability. So if he's going to stay in position, then yeah, I would like to know that he's actually capable of a coherent thought. That would be great.
So, Nick, we've heard that Kamala Harris is raking in the campaign money already. But when we went back and looked at her run to try and become president, she had to drop out before she even made it to Iowa. So are the progressives going to turn out for Kamala Harris? Or is this something where, everybody just kind of looks at it right now and they feel that excitement, but when it comes to November 5th, they won't be there?
So you said it best. The same Democrats that completely rejected Kamala Harris when she ran for president are not overwhelmingly excited about her right now. Here's what's going to happen. Here's the entire campaign strategy. Ready? I'm just going to give it to you. They're going to try to get people excited about Kamala Harris for about 5 minutes. When that fails, they're going to go back to their typical strategy, which is just calling everybody that disagrees with them a racist, a sexist, a threat to democracy. And that's the campaign strategy until November. There it is, free of charge.
Well, and we know that Joe Biden had named Kamala Harris the border czar. And I think we actually have a clip of that because Democrats are trying to forget it. But let's take a look at it real quick.
And so this increase has been consequential. But the vice president's agreed, among the multiple other things that have happened in the meeting, and I appreciate it, agreed to lead our diplomatic effort and work with those nations to accept the returnees and enhance migration enforcement at their borders.
Oh, a masked Joe Biden. But we do have Kamala Harris as the border czar. She was placed in charge of the southern border. And that means something because Democrats are trying to run away from it right now, Nick. And if you just watch mainstream media sources, are they going to be able to get away with this, with her not having, quote unquote, anything to do with the southern border?
Well, I mean, if people cared about mainstream media sources, we'd be in a lot of trouble right now. But they increasingly do not, and for very good reason. It's because they've proven time and again they're not reliable. The bottom line is the reason why Kamala Harris could not get out of the Democratic primary the first time she ran is because she didn't have a record as Attorney General of California that she could run on. She didn't have a record as a senator that she could run on. She didn't have very impressive speaking ability or debating ability, and so she lost. When she became vice president, this was the one thing that she was given that would have been significant, that would have shown that she has the ability to deal with a complex issue and in some ways, at the very least, mitigate it. And she failed dismally. So they're going to have to act like this is not a big deal. And look, to rich Democrat donors, they probably won't care as much because they've got enough money to spare themselves the consequences of their policies. But to working class Democrats whose kids can't go to school because it's been, emptied out in order to be temporary housing for migrants, overwhelmingly of young men between the ages of 25 or 20 and 26, yet those voters are probably pissed. And I don't think they're going to be able to run away from it simply because the mainstream media tells them to.
But if you are the Democratic Party and you're out there as a voter, again, you mentioned a little bit, but do they really care about border security? Because it hasn't been something, right? We've seen the inflows for the last few years under Joe Biden. It's not like they were going and shouting from the rooftops to stop this.
Oh, I don't know. If you looked at some of the town halls in some of these smaller communities, especially in the suburbs of big city areas and even in some of the big cities, you started to see a major difference with the way that they looked at this issue. And this is something where it also gets back to the wealthy Democrats had enough money to avoid the consequences of their policies. Poorer Democrats did not. And so when all of a sudden the border, compliments of Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott went from the border all the way to a neighborhood near you in a sanctuary city, all of a sudden it wasn't so funny anymore. All of a sudden it was a real problem. All of a sudden when it's their kids getting accosted on the way to school or not being able to go to school. All of a sudden when, again, males between the ages of 20 and 26 are getting free food and free debit cards at the same time that working class Democrats are trying to make ends meet. I think a lot of them, not all of them, but I think a lot of them notice that and realize that their party is not doing anything to solve this problem because they've worked themselves into this ideological trap that if they do try to solve any of it, guess what? They're racist. They're xenophobes. So, no, is it going to affect all Democrats? No. But a lot of people that maybe a little bit more in the middle, maybe that really had to deal with the consequences of these policies, I think they're going to come around.
Well, we know that they are going to care about the economy. And I know that we have a CNN clip here. Life is just so much more expensive under a Biden-Harris ticket.
First of all, during COVID, policymakers, they came to the rescue of renters. There were these eviction moratoriums. There was almost $50 billion in aid. All of that has dried up. Layer on top of that, the fact is life is just more expensive right now, right? Americans are paying more for daycare and car insurance and groceries. Yeah. Leaves less money to pay for rent. Also, some of these cities and states, they've actually made it easier, cheaper, faster for landlords to give renters the boot when they're not paying. And then perhaps most importantly, it's just the fact that rent has gone up, right? Americans are paying on average 21% more than they did in March of 2020. But in some cities where evictions are up, like Las Vegas, like Columbus, Ohio, the cost of rent has gone up even more. One economist at Apartment List, he told me there's just been this erosion of affordability, especially at the low end. He said affordable housing has just disappeared.
Nick, my final question for you today is going to be, what can Biden, Harris, whoever is in there on the Democratic side, what can they say about the economy to make any of that seem okay?
They'll do what they always do. They'll attempt to manipulate selective stats in order to make the economy seem like it's better than it actually is. The problem is that you can have CNN and Rolling Stone magazine and MSNBC and everyone else repeat your talking points when people walk into the grocery store and everything is significantly more expensive as a result of monetary inflation, as a result of bad policies which drive up costs. People feel that, and they don't like to be told it isn't happening. So I think the DNC and I think Kamala Harris is going to rely, like they always have, on a very obedient press. And I think they're going to rely on a very obedient Hollywood to basically repeat their talking points as fact. And none of that is going to erase what people feel when they actually show up to the grocery store and can't afford dinner.
Nick, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll break down what FBI Director Christopher Wray said before Congress. Next. Earlier today, FBI Director Christopher Wray testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the Trump attempted assassination. And Wray said that the would-be assassin extensively prepared for his attempt. Todd Bensman is a former terrorism intel manager fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies. And Todd, Wray talked about the internet searches and the drone that he used to scope out the Trump rally venue. So how did he not show up on the FBI's radar?
Well, not everybody shows up on the radar. That's the trick, isn't it? I mean, it gives rise to the old saying that, we have to be right 100% of the time, but they only have to be right once. And this was an almost right once moment. So, this is a young guy. Looks like he was just in high school a couple of years ago. He was keeping quiet, wasn't online very much, didn't apparently speak about his views to very many people. It's almost as though he inherently understood that in order to stay off the radar, you have to just shut up, pretty much. Now, he didn't shut up 100% of the time, we know now, but it's not that hard to stay off the radar. I think, we have these intelligence failures, and we probably always will.
Let's talk about the failures on that day. I mean, when you look at this, what's your explanation for how he was able to get so close, how he's flying a drone on the premises and wandering around for that long?
Well, I think that the best explanation for that is that the Trump campaign, the Trump security team, had been after the Secret Service at the highest leadership levels for well over a year to increase security at these rallies. His professional security staff understood that they were vulnerable, that the former president was vulnerable at these rallies. They were never comfortable. They went after the Secret Service in request after request for more staffing, for more personnel. The Washington Post did a great, rare expose on that exact topic and problem, and they just kept getting turned down on grounds that, well, we're kind of thin everywhere, as though the former president, who is the front runner and probably one of the most hated politicians in the United States ever, doesn't warrant a little extra security. They didn't get it. They never got it. I'm still not sure they're getting it now. I think they're still saying, yeah, we're thin. It's a budget problem. I blame that. There should have been a lot more security out there. The security team knew that they had to have more security. They asked for it over and over again in writing and verbally, and got rebuffed over and over again. It's almost as though somebody wanted something bad to happen. I mean, you could see why somebody would come up with a kind of a theory like that.
And to that point, the Secret Service is now saying, instead of fixing all of the security issues, Donald Trump, please just don't go outside and have outdoor rallies. Just have indoor rallies. Now, this is the United States of America and the Secret Service. Are we really not going to be able to ensure the safety of a former president outdoors after an incident like this?
Right. Well, there's that. And of course, that gave rise to accusations of, well, you just don't want him to have these rallies. They're hugely successful. Don't have rallies. But listen, the real issue here is that you have a front runner, but you could call him the presumptive nominee for a long time. I mean, he won all those primaries. You give somebody like that maximum security, everything that they need, and they didn't do that in this case. So we'll see what happens. The presumptive nominees, the nominee now, he's the kind of guy who was kind of like raising a fist in defiance right after he'd been shot with blood running down. He's not the kind of guy who's gonna be afraid to have a rally now. He's going to be going full throttle.
Todd, but how do you resolve that contradiction, right? He's going to want to have rallies, and I'm very curious what your thoughts are about potentially reaching out to third parties or hiring some of the top private security in the world. As has been pointed out in this show, the Secret Service itself really started as the Pinkertons, or a private force that we realized we needed to provide. In this environment, if he's going to go out in a rally and they're telling him not to, and this has already happened, how could he keep doing that without bringing someone new onto the team?
I mean, he should do it, for sure. He should do it, especially now if the federal government refuses to. But I think that the federal government needs to be exposed for continuing to refuse to provide the Republican nominee for the presidency of the United States, who had just been almost killed in an assassination attempt, not giving them the resources they need. One other thing I'd want to mention is that all of this is happening in the context of a proposed bill of just a couple weeks before the assassination attempt by Democratic members of Congress to strip Trump of even the last bit of Secret Service that he had on grounds that he was a convicted felon. We're not going to give any convicted felon Secret Service protection. So I think that's dead in the water at this point. But just keep in mind that there are people in Congress who, at the very least, who were kind of okay with stripping the nominee, Republican nominee, with even what protection he had.
My last question for you. We saw earlier this week that Secret Service Director Kim Cheadle did resign, and there have been calls for a further, deeper investigation. Are we going to get the type of investigation that is warranted?
Not this year. I mean, potentially in maybe around January 2025. I think that requires at least a bipartisan kind of Warren Commission kind of a thing. This was an attempted assassination. It came really, really close to changing world history. There are a lot of conspiracy theories flying all over the place about who did what, why. Some of it's crazy, some of it's plausible, but that's the reason why you have a Warren Commission on something like this each and every time. I think there ought to be one of those. Whether the current administration will support that is, maybe an open question. I doubt it, but there should be one.
Great stuff, Todd. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
A J6 prisoner was released this morning and flew directly to Blaze Media headquarters. He joins us next. John Strand is a model and actor who went to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th to serve as a bodyguard for Dr. Simone Gold of America's Frontline Doctors. And like many J6ers, John had served time for going to the Capitol that day, and he was released earlier from prison just today at the order of a federal judge. They both join me right now, along with Steve Baker, Blaze Media investigative reporter, who was also present on January 6th and has helped to write about their story. So, John, can you just describe what it was like today when you walked out of prison this morning?
It was amazing. I was so happy to see Dr. Gold and my team ready to greet me and take me out of a very painful, miserable place. And I learned a lot. God did a lot of great things, but it was terrible. So I was glad to get out of there. That's for sure.
And Dr. Gold, what was it like for you to be on the other side awaiting him?
Right. There's so much injustice. From a legal perspective, we didn't know if he would be released. As you know, the Supreme Court ruled on Fisher on June 28th, but you still had to await the judges, saying release. And we got that 8 days ago, and here we are.
John, obviously, I've already had the opportunity to welcome you back to real life. Let's talk a little bit about that. We don't need to tell the stories about January 6th. That's been seen ad nauseum. But you lived through what is the ultimate weaponization of the federal government against you as a citizen of the United States. Give me a little bit more idea what it was like to be there.
Again, I'll use the word miserable. You have a heightened sense of pain and of stress and of angst about everything. So the way I described it was my time in prison was actually split between two facilities. The first half in Miami, where I was actually viciously abused in an isolation environment for about 4 straight months, which was essentially like being waterboarded. And when I was released from there and transferred to another location where it was a little less oppressive, it felt like I was trying to breathe the oxygen of freedom through a straw from underneath a swamp. So,
Blaze correspondent Joe Hanneman has covered your story extensively. In fact, going back a couple of years.
Yes.
And one of the things that I think first brought Dr. Gold and I into acquaintance was the fact that you were being held in solitary confinement, which is essentially torture.
Yeah.
We'll start there. But what she was most concerned about was that we needed to get this message out, but there was a problem with getting this message out.
Yes, there was.
If we get this message out, they tend to punish you more. Is that correct?
Make it worse. That's exactly what happened to me. They fabricated a whole series of ridiculous circumstances to put me in isolation for a couple of weeks, basically to say, watch out. We'll crush you if you look sideways. And I was actually just looking to follow all their rules. They didn't even give me the rule book when I walked in the door, which is a BOP policy violation. So they were already off on the wrong trail. But they pulled me out for a couple days, and then a story that I had nothing to do with went viral on media. Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene reported on me being tortured and abused, and they put me in this interrogation room and grilled me about this like I had something to do with it, like a scene out of a movie, and then threw me back in, and I wasn't seen again for 3.5 months.
And this has been true of defendants, prisoners who have reported on black mold growing in their cells. The water is tainted. The food is spoiled and rotten. And just releasing that information through their attorneys or through their family has caused them to be punished further and thrown into solitary confinement. And that's what you're describing here right now.
Absolutely. The government hates accountability, and they'll bite you for it.
How does a human who is supposed to have community, to be around others, to go through what you did for solitary confinement for 4 months, how did you mentally make it through that time?
I prayed a lot. I'm a man of faith, and my relationship with God is the only reason I even started on this journey, and it's certainly what's kept me strong through it. But I didn't feel strong in isolation. I felt like hell. I was in hell. That was definitely hell on earth. It's the closest I ever want to get to hell. But God is everywhere, even in hell. And he promised me that before I went in. And when I was there, I was able to kind of meet God in a way I never have before. And I already understood this cerebrally, but I put it into practice, and he kind of led me through a process of proving to myself what my faith is about, and what enduring pain and suffering and finding purpose in it, and understanding that joy doesn't mean that everything's great or that you feel great. You might feel like hell, and I did, but joy still exists, and it's something we have to choose and strive towards, and God leads us through that, and he led me out to the other side.
For both of you, what is the most difficult part about this entire journey? Dr. Gold?
For me, I wait for our nation. I'm a doctor and a lawyer, and I've watched the corruption of both of my professions. It's incredible, the lies from the HHS and the CDC and NIH and the FDA, tremendous lies. And then I watch the DOJ lie and the FBI lie and the Bureau of Prison lie. And so I'm watching the collapse of my nation, and it's tragic.
I almost want to kind of say the same thing, actually, that the abuse that they're putting January 6 patriots through is unspeakable, actually. It's so egregious. It's so shameful. But what torments me is that so many people who are quote unquote on the right side or the good side still don't know. They don't know what's really happening. They don't know how easily they're manipulated and fooled by systems. And they're not fully connected to a source of truth that's immovable. Because I'm subjected to all those things too, but I never let go of the source. And so that the lies are what they destroy everything.
And I think that for all of us sitting here, the paths that we have taken, we love America and what it stood for and what we thought it was when we were growing up. How do you look at your country now after what you have gone through in your time in prison?
So I am energized. I am doubled. We are not living in China yet. We are not. We can still speak out. We can still fight back. There are more people that feel patriotic love for our country, our inalienable rights, and we still have an opportunity to push back. John is out of prison. If he had been in China, he wouldn't be out of prison. So the answer is you got to keep pushing back, keep pushing hard. You've got to vote. You got to vote in November. Elections matter.
Also, I will say, so the subtitle of my book, which is called Patriot Plea, is my J6 journey as a political prisoner in the divided states of America. And of course, I say that very intentionally, and I describe what I mean by that in the book. But the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and hoping you get a different result. And I think we have a little bit of insanity on both sides of the political spectrum, and we need to kind of have a reset to understand what's missing, what's off kilter, so that we can actually hit the target we're aiming for.
And I understand you wrote that while in prison.
Yes, I did.
So you were using your time very effectively then. You guys, it's incredible to just sit here and listen to your story and just to say, oh, there's still hope. There's the fact that there is positivity coming out of you, that you're a man of faith. Like, that is encouraging to me to say, this is something that we can get through and come through to the other side. So when I look at you guys, I just want to say, like, this is a hopeful conversation. And do you feel that way today, that this is the day that you've been waiting for and praying for so long?
100%. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it.
You know, we have a much longer, more extensive interview coming out within a couple of days that we were able to conduct today with you right after your release. And then, of course, we've got our story coming out that I'm working on with Joe Hanneman. But you went through the fire. As you said, you went through the hell. Do you have any regrets for choosing the path? Because you did not have to choose this path. You went up against a DC jury, a no-win scenario, and you chose that instead of a plea deal. And most regrets?
No, never. Not for one single second. For 3+ years. And in my case, the government gave me a golden parachute. They were holding a 20-year felony, $500,000 of fines over my head. And they said, if you bend the knee to the government, we'll give you a single misdemeanor. I could have gone home with a slap on the wrist 2 years ago and been living my life. But the plea deal was a lie, and it wasn't just a lie about me. It was a lie about a whole swath of American citizens, and it was a tool of the devil, to be frank. And I said, I'll have no part of that. And I refused.
Americans on the left and the right need to understand that you two did not commit any crimes that day.
No, we were victimized by a government that committed egregious crimes against their citizens on January 6th.
There's a half of this country that wants you waterboarded in Guantanamo Bay for the rest of your life simply because you were exercising your First Amendment privileges. In fact, Dr. Gold, she was scheduled to speak on the Capitol grounds that day at a legally licensed, permitted event. Most people don't even know that those were happening that day, and you were her bodyguard, and that's how you ended up there.
Exactly, but that half of the country that wants us waterboarded or tortured or whatever, what we said earlier was that the problem are the lies, right? Those people have been lied to. They've been lied to so much that they have lost touch with what's true at all. So the lies become the only truth they can hear, and according to the story that they've heard for ad nauseum for 3+ years, would equate to, seems like those people should be in prison if they led a premeditated insurrection to try to take down the government, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
We just want to emphasize, of course, we were not violent. Of course, we were only walking through, the tourist ropes and being peaceful and all that. And people who are hearing our voice now need to understand that our American government is putting people into prison who are absolutely not peaceful, who are, speaking up for free right, free speech, et cetera. So yes, it's an important point.
And meanwhile, you can see, like literally today and every other day pretty much, that there are violent actions taking place on other protests that are just sort of, put that in a box and won't touch that. So
what's next for you, John?
The book is next. I'm very excited about Patriot Plea. You can get that at johnstrand.com. I don't know when it's coming out, but as soon as humanly possible, I would like to see it out before the election. My mission right now is to really advocate for the J6 hostages. Praise God that I'm free and out, but many of them are still being tortured and abused, and it's absolutely shameful. It's a stain on this country. And I am passionate about bringing that to the American people's attention, and also advocating for President Trump, of course, our true president, who is the strongest leader and strongest potential we have to rescue these hostages, and also to rescue the entire country from the control of the left.
Yeah, well, we are so grateful that you chose to spend your first day out here with us. I can't thank you enough.
It was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
All right. Well, we are so happy to bring you stories straight from the source like this one, and we'll have more that we're building here at Blaze Media. We'll tell you about it next. If you watch this show, I hope you're familiar with the Blaze Media brand, but you might not have heard of Blaze Media's one-stop shop for the tech world. So Matthew, I'm going to let you do the honors and tell everybody about what we have going on with Return.
Well, lots of things. First off, we realize that technology is affecting every aspect of our lives, and people aren't taking it seriously enough. And so Return is really there to help guide people. It's to help you pick product services, there's products reviews, it's as practical as that, and also rethink, how you think about tech. And so just some examples that are going on right now in the news. I mean, the Bitcoin conference is about to start. Managing editor for Return, Peter Giedel, will be there. We just learned, we think we'll have an interview with RFK and another number
Junior.
of other...
It'd be a big interview if we had
Yes.
if we had Senior.
Yes, we should say that. And a number of other people will be there. There'll be some surprise guests, and we'll have some more interviews. But the Bitcoin conference is a good example of what's going on. President Trump is going to speak at that conference. That's a big deal, right? And that's because he understands what's going on with crypto and what's going on in technology as people split out politically. Right now, there's a number of people in tech who've come over to Trump's side in the midst of this very divisive election. And there's battles back and forth that are very interesting and going to decide the fate, really, of freedom in America when it comes to how we transact and communicate.
And we know Donald Trump will be there. And Kamala Harris was saying, okay, maybe I will go. At some point, she was confirmed. Now she's not going to go. So there is this back and forth on the biggest stage in politics. And it all really just wraps up in this tech bubble.
Oh, yeah. So Kamala wants to be the most powerful person in the world. And she thought, I should probably go to this. It turns out she's not. But this is the kind of thing, what's going on. What was really going on is, and this is why you have to follow Blaze Media /Return, is that there's a war over control of technology, right? Who controls the technology, controls communications, controls financial transactions, et cetera, et cetera. If you've been watching Glenn Beck since forever, you know this. But to follow that daily and start finding out what's really going on, you'll want to check out Return.
And AI, it gets bigger all the time. I think that, again, if you watch Glenn Beck, you know about it, but it's going to be something that is in people's daily lives.
Yeah, so Return actually published recently Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz's manifesto about little tech and big tech. And this is one of the biggest firms in Silicon Valley, VCs investing in tech. And they say big tech is crushing little tech. And even though one of them is very liberal and neither of them are really doctrinaire Republicans, they said, we're going to start supporting Trump because on this issue, we have to protect little tech. Now, that goes to AI in a very important way. Very important. Is AI good or is AI bad? Can it be used for good or not? Should it be regulated or not? If it's regulated, won't that just help the government and other big corporations that are using it, right? These are very important questions. There's no clear answers. And that is what we're going to get into with Return and segments brought to you by Return here right on Blaze News Tonight.
Absolutely. And it's going to be a huge part of our world. And that's what we're trying to do here with the show, is bring you stories that matter to you, that are in the headlines, but also some of these extra things that really do matter to everybody in their daily lives. Make sure that you go subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps others to find it. We'll be back with all of the top headlines and everything that matters to you back tomorrow night.